Hello everyone, today we make a survey of some types of artillery represented in different manuscripts, illuminations of the 15th century. Unfortunately, for copyright reasons, I cannot use the single summit list of the single pieces that I'm listing now, so I'm just uploading here different pictures of artillery pieces, different kinds, that we will analyze in general, just through our conceptualization of their function, why they get represented the way they did, how they evolve it technologically. So it's quite a mixed bunch of information. As a matter of fact, you don't really need to follow these single, let's say, manuscripts, illuminations, or looking at a single artillery structure under your eyes to get the point of it. This is also not the first video I make on 15th century warfare in general, and on late medieval and to some extent very deeply connected early modern artillery. So today we will essentially stick to the 15th, but I would like to start with say some earlier evidence to basically wrap up a bit where we're coming from with this, right? How and why did artillery develop the way it did? Again, not the first video I make, but there are some conceptual notes that are always important to repeat, to revive, to understand really what the tactical employment of these pieces really was, right? Because very often still in this century we do not get a thorough explanation of the, to use an anachronistic terminology, doctrine was like, because there weren't really military manuals properly meant, at least how they would evolve in the Renaissance to toy, especially in siege warfare, where naturally artillery was most useful with the guns deployment. And so the Trace Italienne, at least in this beginning, at this point, made a video about that, for example, explaining, in fact, through the development of the fortifications, also what kind of guns were employed against that. But as you know, coming from the Middle Ages, what you see is not just that gunpowder artillery was used in parallel to the traditional one, counterweight torsion, and that would remain in spite of the surpassing basically occurring at this point during the 15th. 14th, you still see a lot of trebuchet around. At this point in time, things are getting really tougher. You can see it in many ways also in 15th century warfare in general. Like when you look at the soldiers, for example, this is the peak of armor historically, right? And I made multiple videos explaining why that is the case. But of course, armies in a sense are getting more professional and more qualitative in many ways. And initially, in this sort of post 14th century crisis, you have, as a consequence, a reduced number, but however increasingly effective devices, right? Artillery having been born, as you know, it's not entirely clear, at least gunpowder artillery, whether the 13th century saw a substantial use of it, but it was still it was already there, and it may have been. I've never heard that it could have been earlier. Yes, it may have been possible, as a matter of fact, because we do find it in other parts of Eurasia, also earlier on. That's not much the point. It's really observing how and when this military technology, came around, and how it integrated also with the traditional one. So I uploaded it here. I don't know if it already passed because I mount at the pictures later. But the earliest actual image of a cannon that we have is notoriously it's all on old school books. At least this, it's part of pop culture. An illumination from a treatise by Walter de Millemate, in dating to 1327, it was believed that actually dated to the year before up to recently. This is not very important. Artillery was already around. We know that. We get a lot of documents showing us that even though the terminology is vague, there were firearms being crafted, from this early decades of the 14th century. I will surely make a video about that specifically, so I didn't mean to do it today, but it's important to stress that, of course, before we see just a full clear picture of a cannon, of course, there was a lot of experimentation also in the field and actual operational usage, in fact, of these guns early. They were not, as you know, dramatically performing, but the disproportionate amount of joules that was released by the explosion, was just prefiguring the fact that these guns were, in a sense, the future. It's risky to speak like this, especially for all the time I didn't advise, determinism and technologism, etc. But the point here was just getting the technology to actually absorb that enormous energy to channel the bullets, the projectiles, in the right fashion. And as you know, this early picture is a bit ridiculous after all, because it shows a brass gun, pot-shaped, because it turns out that the only craftsman that had the capacity of creating an actual, say, it's difficult to call it a barrel, because that's of course tending to be straight and uniform. This is just shaped like an actual pot, right? They were pot makers, all right? And there is a head and flights of the projectiles basically inserted from just, at least from the picture, not all the way inside the pot, that especially in the, say, bigger lower part was evidently filled with explosive, and that in this sense was meant to channel clamorously this, the energy, just pushing this, just, we don't know how stuck, projectile in front of in the mouth of the pot that looks like a freaking quarrel with actual flights. This is important because we tend to underestimate, especially at this point, the incredible variety of ingenuity, but also interchangeability of different projectiles and artillery designs, right? Quarrels, say, large arrows shot by, this massive bolts shot by ballista-like artillery, would, for example, very common still at this point. And yet, it's not that we made this dramatic representation of that. We also weren't, of course, able to film a medieval engagement, but of course it would have been somehow struck by, especially these weapons were not considered, as you know, pretty chivalric, were actually used in common, and of course nobody cared about them because alone they were worthless, right? If you didn't have heavy cavalry at this point, in some cases infantry was starting to make it alone, but it was still a great way to go, and in any case you couldn't really operate without the two. These things were not so important, especially in the bigger engagements that were face-to-face open field ones. And so when we talk artillery, of course, we're looking at siege warfare. And siege warfare is performed through literally hundreds of this machinery shooting at the same time. This is how it basically continued, even just with gunpowder technology, right? Because really it was a concert, like the fortresses were still massive. These guns were not enough just individually, of course, to make major breaches to carry them out. Especially this early firearm technology was just not, again, particularly better than or worse to some extent than the traditional one available. It's about the size, which varies dramatically. Naturally, there were smaller numbers of bigger pieces, and vice versa. And everything was used like in a concert, right? Say, arms systems today are basically conceived in the same way, except nobody really cared to make the point about, I don't know, the single hundreds of elements that were routinely used in sieges, so that at best we know of some individual ones known with specific names because they were sort of monster weapons that people were quite relying on, but they also alone could have not operated with the smaller ones. So the early firearm technology in this sense is very mysterious. But we also get that while, of course, across Europe there is a very different level of documentation, at this point the West has a pretty homogeneous spread of military technology. We have seen it, for example, in the Scottish Army organization of the late Middle Ages, that doesn't matter how backwards most of Scotland really was, really every lord had at some point in the 15th century his own gun, right? And you could have not really been, especially from the 20s of the 15th century, a truly updated European prince without some sort of artillery park, right? And it's just like with armor, right? At best you can have countries that are poor, and so they are also less documented, even iconographically, whatever, but you know that the guy who could afford there the finest technology in the market would have it, right? So that you couldn't even properly trace a difference, especially in this point in late medieval Europe. The continent starts being very intertwined, very interconnected, right? Also in terms of, especially of elite equipment, this sort of finer pieces that the actual technology, etc. So it's fascinating. The quarrel that we described before in Walter the Millimate illustration has an iron shaft, right? And the gun is basically, this pot is located over a table, literally on the top of it. It is at least the color of the manuscript is white. The legs of, we're talking the table here, are green, right? That's the few we know. We do not know really whether these colors have anything to do with any specific, I don't know, composition, material, whatever. But the concept is so brutal and primitive in itself. Like you can see the knight operating this gun, enjoying himself, because it would have been a novelty with it. And it's directed, of course, it's firing against a fortification, specifically a gate, which is open, by the way. So the knight is like lighting up with a fuse. It's interesting that it's not a crewman of some sort that would have been less equipped than a knight, right? So this is fascinating because it shows you that, of course, knights were always the most updated guys in warfare, and it's a complete myth that they were insensitive or unintelligent regarding the development of firearms or infantry. That's a completely populistic myth that doesn't find any trace of evidence in all military history, right? If there were some armies of knights that were basically the norm, with other commoners that everybody forgets to mention, by the way, that were defeated, say, by armies of commoners. First of all, it happened rarely at that point, but it also happened because, they were fighting, not because the others were knights or the others were these commoners. And at least if you were to make a comparison, that has nothing to do with the knights thinking that they, that the others were good for nothing, right? That's the greatest myth in absolute terms. Then we can pass to other examples dating to the actual 15th century that, again, I can't show you, but that have all some sort of interesting features. There is an edition of the books of the Grand Khan by Marco Polo. This dates to the beginning of the 15th century, and there is a gun shown in use against town walls along a trebuchet. And the interesting fact is not just the latter pairing, but the fact that this is the earliest known picture portraying trunnions that are basically elevating devices. Pointing was getting more sophisticated, and again, the pairing of the gun with the trebuchet is completely normal, right? Trebuchet, I made, I think, only one video about them specifically, but as you know, they were actually very precise because the counterweight mechanism could allow you to actually calibrate very, very well the actual, ballistically, the actual trajectory that the projectile would follow. And here you have the same problem, right, from a different sort of, different forces, different mechanisms that you find at the beginning of its solving, right, properly using elevating devices to direct the gunshot to in the best possible way against the target. Then we have a 15th century edition of Froissart that, as you know, was in his history is a 14th century source. By the way, I have in store a video about him if you're interested. And so representing a gun of the previous century. The manuscript is dating to the 15th, but we find essentially an iron-barreled gun represented. This is the point. Depicted at the siege of Africa, that is Madia, during the Duc de Bourbon expedition in 1390. And this is an important indicator, of course. The fact that iron-barreled guns began to appear in Europe in the 15th century is doesn't mean actually that there weren't before. They hadn't tried that solution. This is more like an economical factor than truly a military one. In any case, prior to this, guns typically had barrels, as you know, made of bronze or brass, as we observed before, which were more expensive and harder to produce. However, as we know, discovery and utilization of new iron working techniques, mostly hydraulic technology, both for mining and for insufflating oxygen in the furnaces, that's really what had made the take, right, in terms of properly of the homogenization of the metal or the leads, allowed for the mass production of iron-barreled guns, right? I made a video years ago, but at least this was one of the technologies that I was recording have in fact made their way through in the 15th century. Iron was more readily available and cheaper than bronze or brass, making it an ideal material for firearm manufacturing. Additionally, iron barrels were more durable and could withstand higher pressure from gunpowder, which contributed to the growing popularity and adoption in Europe, which again is not about just the convenience of the metal either, because otherwise they would have started doing that with it. But actually, what kind of purpose, like how many, and especially what kind of guns were required, right? What were their performances, and thus doctrinally, what did they have to do in practice? This is what eventually began to show, right, that say iron was the better solution throughout the development, but obviously not before. We have a manuscript dating to the third quarter of the 15th century, depicting in fact a contemporary English bombard, right? And this was basically the earliest type of, the most common type of artillery, the simpler to produce, really. There were different sizes, right? There were some designs, as we see, as the Vogler and the Fowler, that were conceptually similar, but they all evolved from. It would be interesting to make a genealogy of this, but in some cases it can be confusing because it would seem like all guns evolved from the same. It's almost difficult to categorize them because they could be not just in different sizes, but with certain characteristics that, however, are not so easy to just uniformly read in this piece or another, right? But the bombard, in fact, was the most primitive type because it was the simpler, and in many ways also the more effective. Just think about the monster one of Orban and the siege of Constantinople that the Byzantines could not afford because they would have, in defense, they would have destroyed the Theodosian walls just with the recoil of those. But let's say they had been at Crécy, for example, the first illustriously renowned, even field artillery in that case, even though, again, most of field use was, let's say, more like a support, right, rather than properly an autonomous arm on its own. With veritable batteries, but the same 15th century warfare was actually about smaller units interacting in a more creative way than it had been the large, much larger, and sort of in that sense bulkier and more uniformly employed armies of the first half of the 14th. So, say movable guns. I made a video about the Battle of the Molinella, for example, that shows actually the chronicles claim from both sides. In Italy, the first use actually of movable artillery on the field, right? Actually, we know that it already existed, but again, it's a bit like Crécy. It's the idea of the myth that some chroniclers said that was the first time, but of course, we would have found these guns alongside with the armies because they used to bring artillery with them. That's something we often forget, and yes, there was an actual employment of field artillery even throughout all the Middle Ages, right? It was just not. It was the case because some pieces, as we've seen, were smaller but also less effective. They could support it. It depends also where they fought. They were mostly fighting sieges, right? So even when they would meet for a pitched battle, still they were there for siege, and so they would bring some of that artillery with them, especially the beams of the trebuchet, where the rest of the frame could be built on the spot, but the beams were very were store preserved because they were more complicated to make, and so they just didn't create a new one every time. So interesting stuff, considered that guns were quite useful, especially to wipe the floor in city streets, things like that. In fact, early artillery, just torch and catapults, were excellent for that as well, and that's something that the state, whether it's a national monarchy or a city one, really you see that how it monopolizes the creation, especially the maintenance of these guns in the public warehouses. That's very important. They had a very anti-mob function, and it worked. So guns like this bombard depicted in this English manuscript remain in use alongside cannons of much more evolved form until about the end of the 15th century. After that, you don't really find many bombards, right? But still, for example, in a wood carving of the siege of Granada in 1492, you see the same pair. And so, yes, I just made recently a video about some anachronistic weapons like crossbows, longbows, composite bows in early modern warfare. And you can argue that, yes, some old artillery pieces were fundamentally there, that especially the smaller ones were, they had also remained more similar to the early types, because the concept, after all, is that similar, and you can also create and use these weapons in a less complicated way that it takes for creating a much bigger cannon. We have a mid-15th century painted cassone from Florence, showing a local gun with the simplest form of tiller. And this is also interesting. Tillers were mechanisms used to operate artillery pieces, and specifically cannons. And a tiller was essentially a lever or handle attached to the breech of the cannon, used to rotate the gun in different directions for aiming and firing. By the way, I didn't specify that this video is just about, well, I will insert it in the title likely, so you already know it by the time you're listening. is just for land guns, right? Tillers were a thing, as you know, as rotating guns. Naval warfare, there wasn't a radical difference, actually. During the 15th century, you start having really a lot going on at sea that deserves better attention, but in many ways, land and naval technology goes, as far as firearms go, in relative similar parallel tracks. And so this was the point. You use a tiller for rotating the gun, different directions, aiming and firing with greater ease. This is very useful in, for example, siege warfare. As a defender, I don't know, in some circumstances where you can fix the gun somewhere, but you can still shoot it from different corners down the guys, whereas the others have to at least bring the gun in front of them. Say, relatively unimportant difference, but still useful for those who had this more fixed position. The tiller allowed operators to adjust the gun's elevation, traverse, and direction during combat. It was a manual method, of course, of controlling the cannon's movement, which required physical strength, but also coordination from the gun crew, which definitely operated multiple members. So it's fascinating to see, not from an eminently normal source, but yes, caissons were some of them are beautiful works of art depicting military scenes. When we made those videos about the Swiss military, at this point we noticed how Switzerland is really one of the single most successful countries in the world, in part also in spite of the fact that the land literally has nothing in terms of mineral resources, the fortune, right, the ability, the capacity of the Swiss Confederates at the time to crush one of the single most developed armies in the world at the time, one of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, head of the Burgundian state as a whole, is also shown by the depiction of a captured Burgundian serpentine from a Swiss record of booty taken during the wars, 1476-77. It's fascinating because the Swiss really were, in many ways, very primitive. And while listing carefully, right, their meticulous, care about resources, in fact, that does start from that. The say in this case the Burgundian artillery looted, well, they even drew a serpentine that was an artillery type named after its distinctive shape, resembling in fact a serpent or a snake, and it consisted of a long curved barrel made of iron or bronze, still often resembling a twisted or coiled snake. This is how it became also more iconically famous. The barrel was mounted on a wooden carriage or a tripod stand, allowing for easy movement and adjustment. The curved shape of the barrel allowed it to absorb and disperse the powerful recoil created upon firing. They were some of the finest artillery types around. The serpentines were in fact primarily used to shoot projectiles such as stone bolts or iron shot. It was a relatively simple and inexpensive artillery weapon, to tell the truth, but very widespread in Europe during the 15th century. It had some limitations, such as limited range and accuracy, but it did play a crucial role, and especially consider that this went in parallel to other types in terms of, of performance. So they were not, they wouldn't quite use just one type as we understood, and if these ones specifically existed, and that's what we don't understand well, had a specific use that was concerted with all the others, right? But again, it's relevant that the Swiss were also, for this reason, even more, in their case, eager, right, just to document this captured Burgundian gun. Then we have yet another 15th century edition of Froissart, depicting a gun with 2 iron barrels. It has iron-rimmed wheels and a wooden carriage and mantlet. The mantlet, as you know, is just the protection. It's just, we will talk about it later. It's just like a additional defense, right, for in wood, as a wall, right, through which you shield yourself and protecting the gunners. And it was usually pivoted on the 2 uprights. It had ropes attached to its topmost corners so that it could be hoisted up out of the way for firing, so that you wouldn't even need to cut through, and even showing what you were doing with the gun to the enemy, because you could even shoot behind through the, of course, a hole in the mantlet. But this, in the moment in which you would take off the artillery piece, would have sort of showed like in between it, let's say behind that, and not really being that convenient also for protecting the guys operating the gun behind that. But most of the reason was to achieve the surprise effect, where you just rise this thing, you shoot and close. And say it's not that different from how, I don't know, even tanks operate nowadays, right? Going back and forth, covering themselves behind a relief down an upper road or something like that. Because naturally the rate of fire of this stuff was ridiculous, and warfare, generally speaking, was much slower. Of course, there were many less forces involved compared to battlefield like the one of today, materially speaking, physically speaking. But at the same time, it was important for these shots that were very much quality ones, for as far as, in spite of the scarce accuracy, to arrive at some point without notice, right? Especially in siege warfare, this nerve-wracking. It's about waiting. It's about this timing, this dosage of engagement. You may know that there is usually a rhythm. These guns were employed often, and even at the limits of their resistance. Some exploded, some they were quite dangerous. Right, the King of Scotland died because of this as well during a siege. So, but there were in fact some specific needs of employment as well. And there was a competition about, of course, increasing this rate of fire at the time. Just technological changes were very slow after all. There is another English manuscript made in the 3rd quarter of the 15th century for King Edward IV, depicting a fowler or crapaud and a mortar. Now, a bit of vocabulary here. A fowler was type of, naturally evolved, this kind of guns evolved over time, right? It was a type of smoothbore firearm, usually later a long gunnered musket, right? Some characteristics were proper, in fact, of the earliest weapon. It was muzzle-loaded, had a smooth barrel without any rifling. Fowlers were mainly used for hunting birds, but were also used in warfare as early firearms and actual artillery, right? What is fascinating is that also the musket actually was born as mobile artillery originally. That's why it's huge and much bigger and complicated to use than an arquebus. But since it was more powerful, and it was more important to start refining it from there, supplanting eventually the arquebus. So the fowler was not very accurate or powerful compared to later developments in firearm technology, but it was sort of times similar to a bombard in some instances. I uploaded some pictures of it here. And that's why here we do not know exactly whether this is a fowler or a crapaud. The crapaud, also spelled crapaud or crapaudo, typically refer to a type of hand cannon as well, or small artillery piece commonly used in the 15th century. So a Fowler could be both, right? Could be both, and all these pieces actually, if you really look at their designs, were for, generally speaking, both for as handguns than properly artillery pieces, as we've seen also for the musket. Conceptually, it's so early in time, impossible even to distinguish that. Aside from this iconography that is very beautiful, but it does, we can't really tell how many other types existed really there at the same time in size and typology. All right. Hand cannons were early firearms characterized by their short and wide barrels, and were typically fired from a standing or handled position. And the projectiles that could be properly cannonballs or stone shots were loaded directly into the barrel. And the crapode were larger and more powerful than Fowlers, but still lacked the accuracy and range of later firearms, needless to say. But it's this ambiguity between the designs, similarity, that makes it difficult to look what it is. We know what a mortar is, an artillery weapon characterized by its short barrel and high angle of fire. In the 15th century, unlike Fowlers and crapode, mortars were primarily destined for indirect fire, meaning the projectiles were lobbed into the air to strike targets behind cover or in trenches like today. And in fact, that was the point: bombarding fortifications, siege targets within the walls, like just going past above them and falling into the perimeter. And in the 15th century, mortar technology was still developing, and these weapons were often relatively small compared to later versions. They were often mounted on fixed platforms or on the ground. And in this case, we have also a wheel gun carriage for this Fowler / crapode, which therefore is not really this case used as a handgun. You see the extended trails between which a horse was probably harnessed on the march. And the shot is stalled, by the way. And always remember that the greatest cost of artillery was not projectiles, but the actual gunpowder, right? That would always be a huge concern for any army until pretty late in time, historically. Still during the Napoleonic era, were to find all that gunpowder. For mass armies, you had to scratch the saltpeter out of from canteen walls and stuff like that, the oxidation of nitrogen, allowing you to find that element, properly explosive one, in even in these ways. There is a French translation of Xenophon dating to the 70s of the 15th century, showing in an illumination a Fowler on its transport carriage. Right, so reflect also in this case, like the musket, these are artillery pieces that are fundamentally evolving into handguns. In the original manuscript, by the way, a horse is shown harnessed between the shafts as well. I made a video about the logistical problems of early artillery. It was really infernal in many ways, but the fact still that they were brought and they were quite needed, especially in Renaissance warfare, right, goes in parallel with the obvious necessity of developing further these guns, having them on campaign, etc. You have a German so-called firework book that is likely datable to the 40s, the 50s of the 15th century. This shows, again, with an elevating or so-called Burgundian carriage. Right. So the elevating device comprises a curved wooden or iron upright through which a securing pin is inserted. In principle, it's actually the same mechanism for the Burgundian serpentine captured by the Swiss that we discussed before. This is interesting. Every mechanism was still, say, far from standardization at least in a strict sense, but of course there were already some sort of uniform homogeneous systems to solve basically the same problems. In the 15th century, we see around wheeled guns, as we were talking about before, the increase in employment, also in open field, right? This would follow at short distance the men-at-arms, the footmen, etc. And naturally, they were important in sieges as well, because between the ruins, you really want to have something that you can easily advance with or take out of the way, and finding the right corner, the right angle for shooting from. And there are really many different sources illustrating these types of wheeled guns, right? Dozens, really. One of the most famous is the Vigile de Charles VII, dating to 1484. It's a French manuscript where such typically wheeled guns are represented with both brass and iron barrels. This would be the case for smaller guns especially. In fact, judging from the same illustration, they were quite small, and this added dramatically maneuverability, needless to say. In the 1468 edition of Froissart, we find a single crewman swinging one wheeled gun around by its trail to face a surprise attack from the opposite direction. This is fascinating because, let's say, as many other, say, items in military history, we tend to underestimate how dynamic, multifunctional, and adaptable they were, right? And, for example, the painting of armor, which is something we don't always think about, where we think normally, armor, whether mail or plate, we were just metallic looking, right? Actually, many of them were, and also this was really normal, painted, right, with the most different colors, red, blue, green, whatever. And it's been speculated that around this time in history, the same, especially this sort of more frontline displaying gun, were painted as well, either bright red or black, or if of brass, brightly polished at least. It's a bit like, I don't know, the concept of shiny armor, or for the dark, right, the Black Knight, let's say the brunette system to avoid oxidation. Contemporary pictures, however, do show iron barrels as in that typical blue-gray color that stands for the actual metal, without paint, right? Sometimes you have very dark gray, almost black, basically. The carriages that would have been painted as well, in some cases, are shown mostly dark brown, or occasionally a tan color. So the concept is, okay, this is iron, this is wood, respectively, and that's how the illustration went. But again, we aren't there to film an actual medieval battlefield, and still we do have archaeological evidence of actually colored guns as well. Everything was, let's say, clothed in a way that would confer a sort of metaphysical meaning to these weapons. It's just like the armor, like the color was not just random. It would belong to the guy's house, arms. They would express specific characters, etc. And something that if you think about the elderly generations in your family, etc., it's something that emerges. Like, we as a family are a bit like this because of this reason, and we all have a character, right? And it was important for them to see warfare in this way because it gave a moral tone to it. It sort of added also to the psychological effect in combat. Diebold Schilling's chronicles present us with a wide array of beautiful military-themed pictures, many portraying siege warfare. We are talking about the 80s, 1480, 85, and one of these pictures present us with the siege of Neuchâtel by Zurich, and in this picture you can notice some blue and white badge of Zurich on the mantlet of a gun. This is interesting because, like just shields, etc., the same mantlets were sort of branded, right? So the idea here of a painting of these devices is quite evident, right? And the interesting aspect is that in this case, this was probably drawn from one of those that the Swiss captured from the Burgundians in the 1470s, and so it was a way to make these objects, could have been for mantlets or guns, etc., their own, saying this was this, right? Does this belong? And this could be important whenever you were, for example, on the battlefield. Some circumstances were very chaotic, especially again these. Think about storming fortifications, trenches, etc. There was plenty of these. Again, guns covered by mantlets, etc. And some movable ones, as we've seen, also had such mechanisms, and so just carried across the battlefield, one had to know whose it was. It was important in the action to distinguish friend from enemy, but also at the end of the engagement to whose unit it belonged, right? Because most of these forces were all coalition, right? And so there was some rivalry and sort of ways to do inappropriate things for profit in this context. And naturally, there would have been also some more specific, right, detailed forms of identification that here we can't quite see. It's just a picture after all. It's a big deal of a detail, right, to highlight, to represent. There is a nice study of a Burgundian gun position at the siege of Morat in 1476. This comes from the Amtliche Chronicle by Schilling, and the mantlet is interesting. You have a wooden structure fixed to the brass barrel of the gun, fascinatingly enough. So you do have, right, what we were saying here, that properly the attach mechanism through pivot at the front and the support of two struts at the back, showing resting on the ground, at least in the picture, but located on pins on the sides of the carriage. In the aforementioned piece we've seen now, like the one from the siege of Neuchâtel, this is also fascinating. And while on the march, this type of mantlet would have been folded down over the gun, which would have partially protected the gun from the weather, also the dust. Think about these armies on the move. You could have even put something over the mantlet, even though certain mechanisms could have been left unstrained. But in warfare, you just have all this kind of solutions. And speaking of the fixed hoarding through which the gun would fire in this representation, we have a description by Christine de Pisan's Fait d'Armes, we talked about, I think I made a bit about medieval French literature, and we talked about the very famous Christine de Pizan, this Venetian French noblewoman that wrote a dramatic amount of stuff, first of all, in absolute terms, but even more about the military, right, in 15th century France, which is extraordinary. This work dates to 1434, and it explains that these mantlets could be massive, really monstrous, and that's yet another thing you do not see too much, right? We can see just the palisade with these sort of mantlets distributed just to hide the gun behind us, but as big as the guns could be, also the mantlets as a broader system of fortification really was a thing, right? Consider that they were all one with the rest. This is also, I started really the peak of medieval warfare, let's say, in terms of scale, right, of the size of fortification, field fortifications in the early 14th century. It was incredibly complex, and we unfortunately do not know much about this at all, because the terms are always very generic, etc. But we of course appreciate military engineering from many peoples, but we often forget how advanced and really, probably the largest one ever occurred, like the 13th, 14th century one, really was in Western Europe. Like, there were other areas, of course, of the world in which these things were real, but this applies to the mantlets as well. And unfortunately, we don't have too much information, in fact, about this variety, just about the size, which suggests again that for a bigger one there were many other small ones. So this expresses a complexity, a hierarchy, structure of some sort. Christine describes some of these defenses as 3.6 meters wide, 9.1 meters high, and 60 centimeters thick, right? And it is really massive. Others are 7.3 meters high and broad, constructed of boards of more than 12 centimeters thick, and timbers more than 45 centimeters square, mounted on 5 wheels of elm. Right, these were enormous movable defenses for enormous artillery, and it's extraordinary because you understand that they were dimensioned exactly for providing these bigger guns just to approach with some defense. The reason why these are mantlets, by the way, and so you would expect also to be smashed just by other artillery that would create horrendous damage, of course has to take in consideration that normally, at least though the besieged had less than the attackers, so the idea is that even if the enemy had used as large of a gun to shoot against these guys, well, first of all, they were mobile, so you could move them, which could be done also internally by the defenders to some extent, but not with the same freedom. But that this counter artillery fire would have been more diluted, and so these mantlets actually were quite necessary for the same troops, and not necessarily just those operating the artillery as such, not just the crew, but let's say imagine, arriving with these mantlets, loading a massive cannon with not even stone cannon bolts, but mitraille, let's say. How unsophisticated it could be, but you approach it, in front of a gate you had just breached or something. You shot this thing, and then just out of, say, the mantlet had risen for the shot, and after that, men-at-arms poured themselves into the breach. That's rough, right? And this is exactly what these guys were aiming at, because they would receive lots of crossbow bolts on a regular basis, and these mantlets, as we've seen, even 60 centimeters thick, right, or it's a freaking lot, right, would be substantially capable of protecting, of course, the troops, also the lightly equipped adequately from this kind of bolts that were regularly, again, the most frequent. Javelins as well, we often underestimate how still widespread javelins were and how effective they were actually against armor, even in late medieval warfare. Right. Christine also rates as small wheeled mantlets, 3.6 meters wide and 3 meters high, and 10 centimeters thick, each with, as you said, a little wicket open to shoot a gun when there is need. All right, so this reflects the varieties. This was a pretty sizable thing, but you would have in this case what we were saying before, like a little door that you could open just to shoot and then to close, which is a solution to what we were talking about before, right? To maintain the cover. This was done in earlier times also with other kind of weapons, I mean crossbows, etc. Just think about how, again, I'm very interested in the history of pavises, especially in the early era, about which we don't know too much, right? People think of the pavis just as that sort of thing fixed on the ground and or used on the back just for turning when reloading. And so in the latest, let's say, medieval uniformation that occurred in Europe. But of course, there had been an evolutionary, let's say, the pavis was, okay, let's not digress on this, because it was really a shield like the others at the beginning. It was not meant to be that large sort of camping table that we're all familiar with. But the sense that you would have to need, in all time in warfare, that's what I was saying, that not everything that is fixed in front of you is a pavis or evolving from a pavis, right? Some are very complex different things. And also on stone buildings, as we understand now, you would have lots of actual wooden structures designed exactly in this way, right? To provide cover with the greatest protection, comfort, visibility, and defense. And that's also lost, because we know archaeologically that there were lodgings for these structures, etc. But as wood, they basically rot away, and so we just have the more typical. This is valid for even smaller castles, right? People don't often forget that in, I don't know, hundreds of square kilometers territory were hundreds of castles, right? And naturally, we do not see almost anyone. Any of them anymore there. But of course, it is because they were simpler structures, but still very effective in their own regard, in part, of course, in stone as well, but also and a lot with this kind of wooden structures added that created true systems of fortifications, with ditches, palisades, trenches. So something difficult to picture, because aside from let's say small environmental reconstruction, maybe in some video game, etc., the idea of how they were used and how warfare proceeded is not reconstructed at all. I don't think there is a study currently that takes in consideration exactly this kind of complexity, and that's a pity, because most of warfare was really revolving around this, and just we do not have much of a documentary description of that, unfortunately. I studied pretty thoroughly some of this stuff. At some point I will publish something on the channel, but consider that it's all, faulty. The terminology and just the level of depth is from the authors is frustrating, because it's so generic, and just they concentrate rightfully on more important things than that, but still prevents us from understanding the technical details if you're interested in these. And that's why I make this kind of videos, by the way, because I want to illustrate the problem. When we think about an additional defense against this mountain artillery, I made a video about the development and the pace of, say, the increase in scale of artillery, qualitatively and quantitatively. many fortresses had to provide themselves with not just their own gun emplacements and to their walls, but also barbicans and further outer defenses, which from the 30s at least often took the form of timber strengthened earthwork. That is known as boulevard in French, but it actually comes from the German Bollwerk, that is like bulwark in English, which were well stocked with artillery themselves. So as you have seen in open ground, you have say lighter artillery that you can bring in a forward area, and that are smaller, so expandable. And here on barbicans that were and other, sort of temporary defenses, you would need to bring, in fact, this even for defense, this guns in a forward position, right? It could increase the angle of shooting, providing you with a series of advantages that often just like having the higher ground you would normally have. A barbican, as you know, refers to a defensive structure located in front of the main entrance or gatehouse. It was usually, not always, by the way, but it was usually an outer fortified wall. Not usually, meaning that the terminology can be also more generic. But it was standing as an outer fortified wall or tower that served as additional layer of defense, providing protection, creating obstacles for potential attackers. And the barbican often had its own gate, drawbridge. It was just a little copy of the fortress, right? They were literally the same thing. And the defensive features such as arrow slits for archers, murder holes for dropping projectiles on attackers, really all you can think in these terms. Its purpose was to delay and hinder the advancement of the enemy forces, allowing the defenders more time to prepare and mount a counterattack, but the point being also that the barbicans could be built by the attackers as well. As we were talking about the higher ground before, the first task of the besiegers was to create structures that would be as high as the ones of the enemy, and normally they were built at crossbow shot range from the useful ranges list from the enemy fortification. The reason was, first of all, they were trying to blockade the enemy settlement, and so they would create this sort of smaller settlements on their own. There are really lots of beautiful representations of this, especially for the 14th century. I can think of beautiful works of art showing this in pretty concrete fashion. If you think about the Sienese condottiere Guido Riccio da Fogliano, the famous fresco that was made of him, you really have an idea of these structures being identical, sometimes even properly made in masonry, to the cities that were besieging. Not as an entire city, but as this sort of tower, practically, that would have to reach the same height of the one of the enemy, and not allowing, in that sense, any higher ground to be possible, and actually trying to bombard the city from there. So it was wild. And again, how often have you seen this in a video game or in a movie, right? The best you have seen siege towers, battering rams, something like that, right? But actually, most of siege warfare was about this then barbicans, and they would deserve more recognition. I will surely make videos about them specifically. As far as the boulevard or bulwark that we mentioned as well, the term typically referred to a fortified outer wall or rampart that served as an additional line of defense. Right? It was often designed with a broad and raised platform, allowing for greater visibility and the placement of cannons or other artillery to defend against attacks. And yes, the French boulevard is also for the streets, etc. It has actually derived from there because, of course, back in the day, many settlements were that militarized in structure, and so some actual streets were to take that name. Right, and the boulevard was usually located in front of the main castle or fortress walls and acted as a buffer zone, providing more time for defenders to counter any assaults. It could also serve as a defensive structure to protect the main walls from direct bombardment. And as you understand here, the combinations were really they were actually similar. We would probably be struck by the level of homogeneity in the essence of these defenses, right? That's yet another thing that we tend to ignore, like say, oh my god, there were so many different types of castles. But if you look at these structures specifically, yes, they were all different, in particular because the terrain was different, the ground, say just the tactical needs, the settlements, etc. Everything was calibrated differently, but the actual essence of the layers of defense and their concept were incredibly homogeneous, right? Especially in the most advanced military cultures of the time. So it was just by default, right? We think again of the Romans that were to standardize their camps. Made lots of videos about that. Great thing, amazing. Yes, but you do find the equivalent at this point in history as well. Nobody celebrates that, which is sad. It should be both, right? Strongly so. So these boulevard, right, these earthworks are recorded before, among the other circumstances, the gates of Bordeaux in 1442. Right in the 40s, the 15th century, it had likewise become customary for the besiegers to construct similar field fortifications in the form of an entrenched artillery park beyond the range of the defenders' own guns. This is interesting because it happened also in open field. Right, if you look at some important battles, like, I don't know, Nicopolis, this is especially true if you think about the concept of Wagenburg, even among the Hussites. I mean, they are different things. Here we're talking mostly about actual, say, structures in fixed fortifications, let's say, but you could find the equivalent in so many other aspects. And the idea was to cover, like, from this area to spread like a net of trenches and gun positions covered by wooden hoardings and mantlets, so that you would essentially be able to go back and forth with these guns from a central position and exploiting essentially internal lines. I mean, that's the strategic principle behind that. And in this sense, of course, acting also with a bit more of surprise, at least with how you would move. Because for defending, you had to concentrate, of course, forces here or there, depending on the situation. Normally, telling the truth, the attacks happened along the entire perimeter at a time, exactly to avoid this concentration. But let's say it depends on what is being besieged, and especially where a breach is being created. And at that point, you can sort of exploit this internal net of communication to try to defend more effectively. So you understand how complex this is, because it's just you can't do this everywhere, literally, but at the same time you can adapt the situation by digging, by consider that every settlement had a sort of open ground in between that was used for the cattle market or something, and for sieges, right, to concentrate forces there. And it was located, in fact, in say supplies, etc. So it was located in a strategically functional way to this. There are pictures of these systems, and when you look at the Battle of Castillon, you realize that the French closed the 100 Years' War with this attack on a similar entrenched position. Plus, it was part of a bigger thing. We will have a video, hopefully, about the Battle of Castillon. Battles happen relatively rarely in the cycle. I didn't design it like this because there are videos like this one, for example, that are very much needed, even as a broader contextual necessity, right? I'm better off with sort of centellinating the actual sort of what other channels would make the battle, right? People click on it, but it's warfare is. I actually happen to specialize on battles reconstruction, so I don't say it for dismissing it, but I can tell you, even and especially as that guy, that you cannot understand battles if you do not understand the broader logic behind other tactical engagements. So I think you can't quite, you must be able to dimension these differences, these influences, styles, techniques, because there is always kind of a broader logic behind them, and once you get that, you can get a lot about the general warfare and how those military means were applied, not just in a battle, which the audience is not habituated to even understand in, say, strategically, even before then tactically, but exactly for this reason, thinking that warfare is just for that. And even when they're able to tell the usual thing, oh yes, but most warfare was actually siege warfare, telling the truth, it's not entirely correct. At least a lot of warfare was siege warfare, but I think it's debatable that, say, you can call like the majority of medieval warfare siege warfare. I don't think it is the case, and I've been there, literally. Of course, as I was saying before, not with the camera in the actual times. In some places I've been too, because you can't really study military history without visiting the actual places. There are some epiphanies that appear to you really so suddenly when you visit some battlefield. When you understand that you can look at the map or at the satellite image, whatever, for years, but not understanding what that battle really was until you were there, right? It's a mind-blowing experience, and at some point I will explain what I really mean, because how do you understand a battle until you actually see the little valley from which, say, according to all the sources matching the flank attack arrived, solved the battle. I mean, this kind of things, right? Even without having the certainty, because also the historians who write this have not necessarily been there, but and so siege warfare is tough, right? It's tough not just militarily, but historically, because it takes a lot of documentation. I mean, a battle, you can, yes, look at the field and understand a lot of things, and with altimetry, etc., you can have an idea after all what happened in a fairly accurate way, also considering talking about the most important battles are better documented than other engagements, etc. But when it comes to siege warfare, everything is complicated, because you have to actually reconstruct if you want to make something serious, even though the sources are not too specific about this themselves. The actual environment there, I mean, how it was, that city was, that castle was, and it's not always, we don't even know actually, most of the times, and so everything changes on that basis, and that's also mind-blowing. I mean, realizing the limits behind this and the way you are supposed to surpass them, and I think that when you look at the entire picture, it's always better than just focusing on one. But you have to move around, looking at both of them, from the essential to the general, and vice versa. Of course, we will hopefully soon speak about medieval artillery, right? There are lots of interesting things to tell about it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.